The Soviet artillery shells arrived in groups of 6, walking across the frozen ground toward the headquarters building with the methodical precision of a butcher working his way through a carcass. Field Marshal Wilhelm Steinberg watched the explosions through the frost-covered window of his command post, each detonation throwing up fountains of snow and frozen earth that hung in the air for a moment before settling back to the ground like ash from a funeral pyre. The building shuddered with each impact, dust falling from the ceiling beams in small cascades that caught the lamplight and turned the air inside the room into a golden haze. It was December 16th, 1941. The temperature outside stood at 42 degrees below 0 Celsius. The Soviet winter counteroffensive that Marshal Georgy Zhukov had launched 11 days earlier was now tearing through German positions along a front that stretched from Kalinin in the north to Tula in the south, a distance of nearly 300 kilometers. 58 fresh Siberian divisions, troops who had spent their entire lives in climates that made this Russian winter seem almost mild, were systematically destroying Army Group Center, the largest concentration of German military power ever assembled in human history. Steinberg was 61 years old. He had served in the Imperial German Army during the First World War, had watched the Kaiser's empire collapse in the chaos of 1918, had helped rebuild the military in the years that followed, and had commanded Army Group Center since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa 6 months earlier. The invasion that was supposed to destroy the Soviet Union in 8 weeks had instead become a nightmare of frozen equipment, exhausted men, and tactical situations that grew more desperate with each passing hour. He thought about his son, a captain commanding an infantry company in 9th Army's southern sector, wondering if the young man was still alive in positions that offered no shelter from cold that could kill as efficiently as Soviet bullets. The door opened behind him, admitting a blast of Arctic air, and 4 men whose presence transformed this headquarters room into something more significant than just another collection of officers planning another retreat. These were the men Steinberg had served with for decades, had trained with in the years between the wars, had fought beside during the campaigns in Poland and France. They represented more than 200 years of combined military service to Germany, and every one of them understood exactly why they had been summoned here tonight. General Heinrich Rausch entered first, stamping snow from his boots with movements that were sharp and controlled, despite the cold that had numbed his feet during the drive from his command post. At 53, Rausch was the youngest man in the room and the one whose reputation extended furthest beyond Germany's borders. He had written the doctrine for armored warfare that made the word blitzkrieg famous, had commanded the panzer forces that shattered the French army in 6 weeks, and now found himself watching those same forces being systematically destroyed by cold weather that turned engine oil to sludge and froze hydraulic systems solid. General Ernst Hoffmann followed, moving with the slight limp he had carried since taking shrapnel in his left leg during the battle for Smolensk in July. He commanded 4th Panzer Group northeast of Moscow, 300 tanks and 50,000 men who were currently being pressed back by Soviet attacks that came in waves throughout the day and night. Hoffmann was 56 years old, a career officer who had joined the Army in 1904 and whose service record read like a history of German military operations for the past 4 decades. General Adolf Richter came next, his face showing the exhaustion of a man who had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in the past 2 weeks. At 59, Richter commanded 9th Army, the formation currently absorbing the heaviest Soviet attacks and suffering casualties at a rate that would destroy the entire force within another month if nothing changed. Richter had raised his sister's son after her husband was killed in the trenches near Verdun in 1916, and that young man, now Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, served in Richter's own command. The general knew with absolute certainty that if his army was forced to remain in its current positions, the boy he had helped raise would be among the dead before January ended. The last to enter was General Franz Waldheim, chief of the Army General Staff, who had flown in from Berlin that afternoon in weather that grounded most aircraft. Waldheim was 58, the highest-ranking professional military officer in the German armed forces, and the man who bore responsibility for translating Adolf Hitler's strategic visions into operational reality. He had spent the past 3 months watching those visions collide with material facts in ways that produced casualty reports of such magnitude that he sometimes wondered if the numbers were real or if he had slipped into some nightmare from which he would eventually wake. Steinberg waited until all 4 men had removed their coats and gathered around the map table that dominated the center of the room. The map showed Army Group Center's positions with painful clarity. Red arrows marked Soviet penetrations. Blue symbols indicated German units. And the empty white spaces between them represented gaps in the line where no forces existed at all. The situation was deteriorating hour by hour, and every officer in this room understood that without immediate action, the largest German military formation on the Eastern Front would cease to exist as a functional fighting force before the year ended. The 5 generals stood in silence for a moment, looking at the maps, understanding what those colored marks and symbols meant in terms of human lives and tactical possibilities. Outside, the artillery barrage shifted targets, the explosions moving away from the headquarters building and toward the supply dumps 2 kilometers to the east. Somewhere in the distance, a German 88mm anti-aircraft gun opened fire, the distinctive crack of its discharge cutting through the deeper rumble of the Soviet bombardment. Steinberg spoke first, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man stating facts rather than offering opinions. We have approximately 48 hours to make a decision that will determine whether this army group survives or is destroyed in place. The Soviet forces attacking our positions outnumber us by a ratio of nearly 3-to-1 in infantry and worse than that in armor and artillery. Our casualties over the past 11 days have exceeded 180,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing. We are losing an average of 16,000 men per day. At current rates, Army Group Center will be combat ineffective by the first week of January. Rausch moved to the map, his finger tracing the positions held by his 2nd Panzer Army along the southern portion of the front. My forces began this campaign with 900 operational tanks. As of this morning, I have 147 vehicles that can move and fight. The rest are frozen solid, broken down, or destroyed. The cold is killing us faster than the Russians. Yesterday, I lost 12 tanks to mechanical failure and 3 to enemy action. Engine oil freezes at these temperatures. Hydraulic systems fail. Tracks snap like frozen rope. The Maybach engines were not designed for this climate. Hoffmann added his own assessment, speaking in the measured tones of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. 4th Panzer Group has suffered 43,000 casualties since the Soviet counteroffensive began. That represents 60% of my authorized strength. Some divisions are down to regimental size. I have battalion commanders leading forces that should be commanded by lieutenants. We are running out of ammunition, fuel, and food simultaneously. Current supplies will sustain combat operations for approximately 36 hours, after which my men will be fighting with whatever they can scavenge from the dead. Richter's contribution came with the weight of personal anguish beneath the professional analysis. 9th Army lost 7,100 men yesterday, 7,000 in a single day. Most of them died from cold-related injuries, not enemy fire. We have over 20,000 frostbite casualties requiring immediate medical evacuation, but our medical system collapsed a week ago. Men are dying from infected wounds that would be survivable under normal conditions. I am watching an entire army freeze to death while following orders to hold positions that have no strategic value and cannot be adequately supplied. My nephew writes that his platoon burns furniture and ammunition crates to stay warm, that they share blankets because half their winter equipment never arrived, that men are dying in their sleep from cold that penetrates every shelter they can improvise. Waldheim pulled a folder from his briefcase and opened it on the map table. The document inside was stamped with classification markings and bore the signature of the Army High Command. I have been compiling casualty projections based on current attrition rates. If we maintain our present positions through the end of January, Army Group Center will suffer an additional 300,000 casualties. That number is conservative. It assumes the Soviets do not increase the tempo of their attacks, which they almost certainly will. It assumes our supply situation does not deteriorate further, which it almost certainly will. And it assumes we do not face a major encirclement, which becomes more likely with each passing day. The numbers hung in the air like an executioner's verdict. 300,000 casualties. the equivalent of 15 full-strength divisions. An entire army group bled to death over 6 weeks because of a decision to hold positions that could not be held. Steinberg looked at each man in turn, seeing in their faces the same understanding he felt himself. They were not discussing abstract military theory or engaging in staff college exercises. They were talking about hundreds of thousands of soldiers, most of them young men in their 20s, who would die unless someone made a decision that prioritized their lives over political considerations. The professional military decision is obvious. We conduct an immediate tactical withdrawal to positions approximately 100 kilometers west of our current lines. We establish defensive positions along the natural barriers of the Ugra and Reseda rivers. We consolidate our forces, shorten our supply lines, and use the respite to rebuild our combat strength. Come spring, when weather conditions favor our tactical and technological advantages, we resume offensive operations from positions of strength rather than watching our army disintegrate during a winter we are not equipped to survive. Rausch nodded agreement, his expression carrying the bitter knowledge that professional military logic and political reality had ceased to have any connection. Everything you just said makes perfect sense from an operational standpoint. It is also completely unacceptable to the Führer, who has made his position absolutely clear during every communication over the past 2 weeks. No withdrawals under any circumstances. Hold every position to the last man. Retreat equals defeatism equals treason. Hoffmann's voice carried an edge of something that might have been anger or might have been despair. So we are expected to watch our men die for no military purpose other than satisfying the Führer's conviction that willpower can overcome material reality. We are professional soldiers being ordered to behave like ideological fanatics. And if we object, we face relief from command for lacking sufficient determination. The room fell silent again, the 5 generals confronting the central dilemma that had brought them together tonight. They could obey orders they knew with absolute certainty would result in the unnecessary deaths of hundreds of thousands of men. Or they could do what their professional training, their decades of military experience, and their personal consciences told them was necessary, knowing that disobedience would end their careers and possibly their lives. Waldheim broke the silence with a suggestion that transformed this meeting from a discussion into a conspiracy. What if we present a united front? Not one general requesting permission to withdraw, but 5 senior officers representing the entire command structure of Army Group Center, making a formal appeal based on professional military judgment. We draft a document that lays out the situation with complete honesty. We include casualty figures, supply data, tactical assessments. We make it clear that we are not requesting permission to abandon the campaign, merely to conduct a temporary tactical adjustment that will preserve our combat power for future operations. Rausch understood immediately what Waldheim was suggesting and recognized both its potential effectiveness and its enormous risk. You want us to sign a joint document requesting authorization for withdrawal. If the Führer approves, we save the army. If he refuses and we obey, we have at least made our professional judgment clear for the historical record. If he refuses and we proceed anyway, we all face court-martial together. There is a certain elegance to it. We have served together for decades. We might as well be fired together. Steinberg felt something shift in the room, a collective movement from discussion toward decision. These 4 men represented the accumulated military expertise of the German officer corps. They had trained together at the War Academy in the 1920s, had studied the campaigns of Frederick the Great and Napoleon, had internalized the lessons of the First World War, and had helped create the tactical innovations that made the Wehrmacht the most effective fighting force in the world. If they could not convince Hitler to permit a rational military decision, then the entire relationship between political leadership and professional military advice had broken down completely. We draft the document tonight. We all sign it. We transmit it to the Führer's headquarters tomorrow morning. We give him 24 hours to respond. If he approves, we begin the withdrawal immediately. If he refuses, we each make our own decision about what happens next. Agreed? The 4 generals nodded, the gesture carrying the weight of men committing themselves to a course of action that would define the rest of their lives. Richter moved to the desk and began pulling out paper and pens. Waldheim opened his briefcase and extracted a sheaf of statistical reports. Rausch and Hoffmann leaned over the maps, identifying specific positions and calculating distances for the proposed withdrawal. For the next 4 hours, the 5 generals worked together to create a document that represented everything they knew about military operations, everything they had learned during their collective 2 centuries of service, and everything they believed about their duty to the men they commanded. The document they produced was 12 pages long, single-spaced, dense with tactical details and statistical analysis. It cited casualty figures broken down by unit and cause of death. It included ammunition consumption rates and supply delivery capacities. It detailed equipment losses and weather-related degradation of combat effectiveness. It proposed specific defensive lines based on terrain analysis and force concentration requirements. The final paragraph was shorter than the rest, stripped of technical jargon, written in language that any reader could understand regardless of military background. We have served Germany faithfully for 4 decades. We have commanded armies in battle and led men in combat. We have studied warfare as both science and art. We make this request not from cowardice or defeatism, but from professional judgment and moral obligation to the soldiers under our command. We believe this withdrawal is militarily necessary. We believe it will save hundreds of thousands of German lives. We believe it represents the best chance for ultimate victory. We request the Führer's authorization to proceed. All 5 signatures appeared at the bottom of the page. Wilhelm Steinberg, Field Marshal, Army Group Center; Heinrich Rausch, General, 2nd Panzer Army; Ernst Hoffmann, General, 4th Panzer Group; Adolf Richter, General, 9th Army; Franz Waldheim, General, Chief of Army General Staff. The document was encrypted and transmitted to Hitler's headquarters at Rostenburg in East Prussia at 0600 hours on December 17. The 5 generals separated after the transmission, returning to their respective commands to wait for a response that would determine whether they had just saved an army or ended their careers. The reply arrived 14 hours later, delivered by teletype in text that had been personally approved by Adolf Hitler. The message was brief, written in the clipped style Hitler used when issuing orders that would tolerate no discussion or interpretation. To Field Marshal Steinberg and co-signatories, your request is denied. There will be no withdrawal of any kind under any circumstances. Every position will be held to the last man and last bullet. Commanders who request permission to retreat demonstrate defeatist attitudes incompatible with leadership responsibilities. The 5 officers who sign this document will report their decision within 24 hours. Either they will obey this direct order and hold their current positions, or they will be immediately relieved of command for lacking the determination necessary for their posts. There will be no further discussion of this matter. Adolf Hitler. Steinberg read the message 3 times, each reading confirming what the first had made clear. Hitler was not interested in professional military advice. He was not concerned with casualty rates or tactical realities. He had made a political decision based on ideological conviction, and that decision would be enforced regardless of the military consequences. The telephone on Steinberg's desk rang at 1800 hours. It was Rausch, his voice tight with controlled fury. I assume you received the same response I did. The Führer has given us 24 hours to choose between our careers and our men. I am flying to Rostenburg tomorrow morning. I am going to present our case directly to Hitler, face to face. If written arguments and statistical analysis cannot convince him, perhaps looking him in the eye while explaining that we are watching an entire army die will have some effect. Steinberg felt something close to hope for the first time since the Soviet counteroffensive began. Rausch was the most respected armor commander in the Wehrmacht, the officer whose tactical innovations had revolutionized modern warfare. If anyone could make Hitler understand the reality of the situation, it would be the man who had proven his genius on battlefields from Poland to France. If he listens to anyone, he will listen to you. Take every piece of evidence we compiled. Show him the photographs of frostbite casualties. Show him the reports of tanks frozen solid. Make him understand that we are not requesting permission to abandon the campaign just to survive the winter. Rausch's laugh was bitter and short. I will do my best, but if I do not return, you will know the answer, and you will have to decide what comes next. The call ended. Steinberg sat alone in his headquarters as darkness fell outside, and the temperature dropped toward -45 Celsius. Somewhere to the east, his soldiers were huddled in positions that offered no protection from the cold, burning furniture and ammunition crates to stay alive, sharing blankets and body heat, dying by the hundreds from exposure and frostbite, and the accumulated effects of exhaustion that had pushed human endurance past its breaking point. The brotherhood of 5 generals who had served Germany for decades was about to be tested in ways that would determine not just their individual fates, but the future of every soldier under their command. Within 48 hours, that brotherhood would begin to fracture under pressures that no amount of shared history or professional respect could withstand. Rausch's aircraft departed for East Prussia at 0700 hours on December 18th. The meeting with Hitler was scheduled for 1400 hours. Steinberg spent the morning reviewing casualty reports and trying to prepare for whatever came next. The numbers continued their relentless upward climb. 16,000 casualties yesterday, 17,000 the day before. At some point, those numbers would stop being statistics and become a catastrophe from which the German army would never recover. The telephone call came at 16:30 hours. It was Waldheim, speaking from Berlin, his voice carrying the flat affect of a man delivering news he could barely process himself. Rausch has been relieved of command, effective immediately. The meeting with Hitler lasted less than 30 minutes. Hitler refused to discuss tactical details or review any of the evidence Rausch presented. He accused Rausch of cowardice and defeatism. When Rausch persisted in his arguments, Hitler terminated the meeting and issued orders for Rausch's immediate relief. He has been placed on indefinite leave and ordered to return to Berlin. His career is over. Steinberg felt the words like physical blows. Rausch was the panzer genius, the officer whose tactical brilliance had shaped modern armored warfare, the man who understood better than anyone how to employ mobile forces in offensive operations. If Hitler would fire Rausch for requesting a tactical adjustment based on sound military reasoning, then no officer was safe from relief for telling uncomfortable truths. What are his orders regarding the rest of us? Waldheim's pause stretched long enough that Steinberg knew the answer before the words arrived. Hitler considers the joint request to be evidence of a defeatist attitude among senior commanders. He is watching the 4 of you closely. Any further request for permission to withdraw will result in immediate relief from command. He has made it clear that he expects absolute obedience to his stand-fast order, and that he will replace any commander who cannot or will not follow that order without question. After the call ended, Steinberg sat motionless at his desk, staring at the maps that showed his forces being compressed into positions that would become killing grounds if they could not maneuver or withdraw. The Brotherhood had just lost its first member. The officer they had sent to speak truth to power had been destroyed for his honesty. The message could not have been clearer. Professional military judgment was no longer wanted or tolerated. Only absolute obedience would be accepted, even when that obedience guaranteed catastrophic casualties. The second fracture came 36 hours later, and this time it came not from Berlin, but from the front lines where tactical realities could not be ignored or wished away through ideological conviction. Hoffmann's 4th Panzer Group was holding positions northeast of Moscow when Soviet forces achieved a breakthrough that threatened to encircle 3 full divisions, approximately 40,000 men. The penetration happened during the early morning hours of December 20th, exploiting a gap in German lines that had opened when an infantry division collapsed under the weight of human wave attacks supported by massed artillery. By 0800 hours, Soviet armored columns were 12 kilometers behind German front lines and driving west with enough momentum to complete the encirclement within 6 hours. Hoffmann faced a choice that admitted no middle ground. He could follow Hitler's stand-fast order and watch 40,000 men be surrounded and destroyed, or he could order an immediate withdrawal to positions behind the breakthrough, sacrificing approximately 20 kilometers of ground, but preserving 3 divisions that could fight another day. The telephone call to Steinberg came at 0900 hours. Hoffmann's voice was steady, the tone of a man who had made a decision and would accept whatever consequences followed. Soviet breakthrough on my northern flank threatens to cut off 2nd Corps. 3 divisions will be encircled within 6 hours if they maintain current positions. I am ordering an immediate withdrawal to defensive lines behind the Soviet penetration. The movement will begin in 30 minutes. I am informing you as a courtesy, not requesting permission. I will not watch 40,000 men be destroyed when I have the tactical authority to save them. Steinberg understood immediately what Hoffmann was doing and recognized the impossible position it created. If Steinberg reported the withdrawal to higher command, he would be betraying a friend and brother officer who was making a sound tactical decision based on battlefield conditions. If he remained silent and became complicit in Hoffmann's disobedience, he risked his own relief from command and possible court-martial for failing to enforce Hitler's direct order. Ernst, if you proceed with this withdrawal, Hitler will demand your court-martial. I will be ordered to sign the charges. You will lose everything: your rank, your pension, your honors. 40 years of service will be erased. Hoffmann's response came without hesitation or doubt. Then I will lose everything. But those 40,000 men will live to fight another day, and they will remember that when the choice came, I chose them over my career. Report this conversation if you must. Court-martial me if you must. But I am giving that withdrawal order, and nothing you say will change that decision. The call ended. Steinberg sat with the telephone receiver still in his hand, feeling the brotherhood fracture for the second time in 3 days. Rausch had been destroyed for speaking truth. Hoffmann was about to be destroyed for acting on professional judgment, and Steinberg himself faced a choice that would define not just his career, but his character. He could report Hoffmann's unauthorized withdrawal and become the instrument of his friend's destruction. He could remain silent and risk his own position, or he could join Hoffmann in open disobedience, accepting that such a decision would end his career, but might inspire other commanders to prioritize military necessity over political orthodoxy. The decision, when it came, was not based on career calculations or risk assessment. It was based on the recognition that remaining silent would make him complicit in whatever happened to Hoffmann, and that complicity was a burden he could not carry. He picked up the telephone and placed a call to Hitler's headquarters. The conversation that followed was brief and professional. Steinberg reported that General Hoffmann had conducted an unauthorized tactical withdrawal in violation of direct orders. He provided the specific details of the withdrawal, the tactical justification Hoffmann had cited, and the number of troops involved. He spoke in the flat monotone of an officer filing a required report, betraying neither approval nor condemnation of Hoffmann's actions. The response from Hitler's headquarters arrived 6 hours later. General Ernst Hoffmann was relieved of command, effective immediately. Court-martial proceedings would begin within 1 week. Charges would include disobedience of direct orders in wartime, failure to execute combat directives, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Field Marshal Steinberg was directed to sign the formal charges as Hoffmann's superior officer and to ensure all evidence was properly documented for presentation to the military tribunal. Steinberg read the orders and understood that he had just signed the death warrant for his friend's career. Hoffmann's tactical withdrawal had succeeded brilliantly, saving 3 divisions from encirclement and destruction. But that military success would now be prosecuted as criminal disobedience, and the officer who had made the correct tactical decision would be publicly humiliated and stripped of everything he had earned during 4 decades of service. The telephone rang again at 2200 hours. It was Richter, calling from 9th Army headquarters, his voice heavy with exhaustion and something that might have been despair. I heard about Hoffmann. I heard about Rausch. I know what you are facing now, but I need you to understand my position. Hans is like a son to me. I raised him after my sister's husband died at Verdun. If I disobey orders and face court-martial, the regime will destroy not just my career, but my family. They will target Hans, use him as leverage, perhaps even court-martial him for my disobedience. I cannot risk that. I am choosing obedience, not because I believe it is right, but because I cannot bear the thought of what will happen to the boy if I resist. Steinberg understood. Richter was not a coward. He was a man who had raised his sister's son as his own child, making calculations that included considerations beyond pure military logic. The regime they served had made it clear that disobedience would be punished not just professionally but personally, that families could be targeted and destroyed along with careers. I do not judge you, Adolf. Every man must make his own choice based on his own circumstances. But understand what your choice means. Your army will suffer casualties that could be prevented. Men will die who might have lived, and you will carry that knowledge for the rest of your life. Richter's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. I know. God help me, I know. The brotherhood of 5 generals had now fractured completely. Rausch was in exile, his career destroyed for speaking truth to power. Hoffmann faced court-martial for making a tactically sound decision that saved 40,000 men. Richter had chosen obedience over professional judgment, accepting that his choice would result in unnecessary casualties. Waldheim remained in Berlin, watching the disaster unfold from the strategic level, but powerless to influence tactical decisions. And Steinberg stood alone at the center, forced to choose between friends, between principles, between the army he commanded and the regime he served. He walked to the window and looked out at the frozen landscape where his soldiers fought and died. Somewhere in that darkness, young men were sharing their last rations, burning their last fuel, firing their last ammunition. They trusted that their commanders would make decisions based on military necessity rather than political calculation. They believed that professional soldiers would prioritize their welfare over career advancement or ideological purity. The telephone on Steinberg's desk would not ring again that night, but tomorrow morning he would be required to sign the court-martial charges against Ernst Hoffmann, transforming a professional disagreement into a criminal prosecution. Tomorrow afternoon, he would receive updated casualty reports showing how many men had died while he wrestled with questions of loyalty and obedience. Tomorrow evening, he would face the same choice Hoffmann had faced, the same choice every commander in Army Group Center now confronted daily. Obey orders that guaranteed catastrophic casualties, or disobey and accept personal destruction. The pistol on Steinberg's desk sat next to the casualty reports, and the court-martial orders, and the maps that showed Soviet forces advancing through gaps his army could not defend. Some German generals, when faced with impossible choices and certain disgrace, chose a third option that required neither obedience nor disobedience, but simply an end to all choices. Steinberg looked at the pistol for a long time. Then he picked up his pen and began drafting the charges against the man who had been his friend and brother in arms for 30 years. The brotherhood was broken, the choice had been made, and the consequences would echo through the remainder of the war and into history itself. Outside, the temperature fell to -48 degrees Celsius. The casualties continued to climb, and somewhere in Berlin, Heinrich Rausch sat alone in his apartment, listening to radio reports of German forces being pressed back all along the Eastern Front, knowing that everything he had warned about was coming true, and knowing that the truth had cost him everything. The court-martial of General Ernst Hoffmann began on January 7, 1942, in a conference room that had been cleared of furniture, except for a long table where 3 military judges sat in uniforms pressed to razor-edge precision. The room was unheated, cold enough that breath formed clouds in the air, and the men assembled there kept their greatcoats buttoned to the throat. Outside, the temperature held steady at -38 degrees Celsius, and the distant rumble of artillery fire provided a constant reminder that the war continued regardless of the legal proceedings taking place inside this frozen building. Hoffmann stood at attention before the tribunal, his uniform stripped of all insignia, except for the basic rank markings that identified him as a general officer, though everyone present understood those markings would not survive the day. Field Marshal Wilhelm Steinberg sat at the prosecution table, the formal charges arranged in neat stacks before him, each page representing another nail in the coffin of a friendship that had lasted 3 decades. The presiding judge, a colonel from the Judge Advocate General's office who had never commanded troops in combat, read the charges in a voice that carried no inflection or emotion. General Ernst Hoffmann, you stand accused of willful disobedience of direct orders during wartime, specifically the unauthorized withdrawal of 2nd Corps from assigned defensive positions on December 20th, 1941, in direct violation of the Führer's explicit directive that all positions be held without retreat. How do you plead? Hoffmann's response came clear and steady. The words of a man who had spent the past 2 weeks preparing for this moment and had resolved to face it with dignity and tact. Guilty as charged. I ordered the withdrawal. I knew it violated direct orders. I would make the same decision again under identical circumstances. The admission sent a ripple through the small audience of staff officers who had been assembled to witness the proceedings. Military courts-martial typically involve defendants who denied guilt or claim misunderstanding of orders. Officers who confessed to disobedience while simultaneously affirming they would repeat their actions represented a challenge to the entire system of military discipline that the tribunal was designed to enforce. The prosecutor, a major who had been specially selected for his political reliability, rose to present the case against Hoffmann. His presentation focused not on military necessity or tactical justification, but on the principle of obedience itself, arguing that modern warfare required absolute submission to the chain of command and that officers who substituted their own judgment for explicit orders from higher authority undermined the discipline essential for military effectiveness. Field Marshal Steinberg was called to testify as the commanding officer who had received Hoffmann's notification of the unauthorized withdrawal. He took the witness chair and provided factual testimony about the telephone conversation, confirming the date and time, repeating Hoffmann's exact words as he remembered them, and acknowledging that Hoffmann had clearly stated his intention to proceed with the withdrawal, regardless of orders forbidding such action. The prosecutor pressed for more, attempting to get Steinberg to characterize Hoffmann's motivation or state of mind during the conversation. Steinberg's responses remained strictly factual, offering no interpretations or judgments, speaking in the clinical tone of an officer filing a required report. But when the prosecutor asked directly whether Steinberg believed Hoffmann's action constituted a betrayal of military duty, the answer came with a precision that cut through the political theater. General Hoffmann made a tactical decision based on battlefield conditions that threatened the encirclement and destruction of 3 divisions. His decision saved approximately 40,000 men who would otherwise have been lost. From a purely military standpoint, his action demonstrated sound judgment and proper understanding of operational necessities. Whether that military success justifies violation of direct orders is a question for this tribunal to answer, not for me. The words hung in the cold air like an indictment of the entire proceeding. Steinberg had answered the question while simultaneously making clear that professional military judgment and political orthodoxy existed in different realms, and that the court was being asked to subordinate the former to the latter. Hoffmann was permitted to make a statement in his own defense. He rose and spoke for 7 minutes, delivering what amounted to a professional soldier's manifesto on the relationship between orders and conscience. I do not dispute the facts as presented. I violated a direct order. I did so knowingly and deliberately. My justification is simple. 3 divisions, 40,000 German soldiers, were about to be encircled and destroyed. I possess the tactical authority and military means to prevent that disaster. I chose to save 40,000 men rather than follow an order that would have resulted in their deaths. If the principle of military discipline requires that I be punished for that choice, I accept the punishment. But I will not apologize for saving the lives of men who deserve better than to be sacrificed for a political decision made by leaders hundreds of kilometers from the battlefield. The tribunal deliberated for 47 minutes before returning with a verdict that had been foreordained from the moment charges were filed. Guilty on all counts. Sentence to include immediate cashiering from the armed forces, forfeiture of all rank and honors, loss of all pension rights accrued during 38 years of service, and permanent prohibition from holding any position of public trust within the Reich. The judges rose and filed out. The small audience dispersed. Steinberg gathered his papers and walked to where Hoffmann stood, now officially a civilian whose military career had been erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. They stood face to face, 2 men who had served together since before most of the soldiers currently fighting on the Eastern Front had been born. Hoffmann broke the silence first, his voice carrying no bitterness or recrimination. You chose your career. I chose my men. History will judge us both. I hope you can live with your choice, Wilhelm. I know I can live with mine. Steinberg wanted to say something that would bridge the gap between them, some words that would acknowledge the impossible position they had both faced. But the gap was unbridgeable, created not by their choices but by a system that forced such choices in the first place. He simply nodded and walked away, leaving Hoffmann standing alone in the frozen conference room where the cost of saving 40,000 lives had just been calculated at the destruction of one career. 3 days after Hoffmann's court-martial, on a morning when fresh snow had covered the frozen ground and the temperature climbed almost to minus 20 degrees Celsius, Steinberg received a telegram from Ninth Army headquarters. The message was brief and official, stripped of unnecessary words in the way military communications always were when conveying information that would break hearts. Captain Wilhelm Steinberg, Jr., commanding 2nd Company, 4th Battalion, 115th Infantry Regiment, had been killed in action on January 9th during a Soviet assault on positions his company had been ordered to hold despite being outnumbered 4-1. The company had suffered 90% casualties before the survivors were permitted to withdraw. Captain Steinberg had died leading a counterattack that allowed 32 men to escape encirclement. The telegram included the standard expressions of condolence and commendation, noting that Captain Steinberg had performed his duties with exceptional courage and that his sacrifice would be honored in accordance with military tradition. But for Steinberg, reading those words in his headquarters office, while listening to the same artillery fire that had provided background noise to his son's death, the official language meant nothing. His son was dead. The boy had followed orders, held his position, and died for ground that would be abandoned 3 days later when Soviet pressure made the position untenable anyway. Steinberg filed the telegram with the other casualty reports, added his son's name to the list of officers killed in action, and returned to the maps that showed more positions that could not be held and more men who would die holding them. He did not call Richter, though he knew the general would understand what it meant to lose someone you loved to orders that made no military sense. He did not inform Hoffmann, who was already in Berlin, beginning his new life as a cashiered officer. He simply added one more name to the casualty list and one more weight to the burden of choices that had seemed reasonable at the time, but now felt like betrayals of everything that mattered. The brotherhood had not just fractured, it had consumed its own children, and the father who had chosen preservation over principle now understood exactly what that choice had cost. 300 kilometers to the south, General Adolf Richter stood in his command post reading casualty reports that turned his decision to choose obedience into a chronicle of preventable deaths. Ninth Army had lost 7,100 men on December 19th, 6,800 on the 20th, 8,200 on the 21st. The numbers continued their remorseless climb through Christmas and into the new year. By January 7th, the same day Hoffmann was being court-martialed for saving lives, Ninth Army had suffered 63,000 casualties in 3 weeks. The reports broke down causes of death with bureaucratic precision: 40% combat-related wounds, 35% frostbite and exposure, 25% disease, exhaustion, and starvation. The categories meant nothing to the men who died, but they meant everything to commanders attempting to understand how an army could be destroyed by weather as efficiently as by enemy action. Richter kept a separate file in his desk drawer, one that would never be included in official reports or transmitted to higher headquarters. It contained letters from company and battalion commanders describing conditions at the front in language that bypassed official euphemisms and spoke plainly about what was happening to soldiers forced to remain in positions that offered no shelter and received no adequate supplies. One letter, from a captain commanding an infantry company reduced to 43 men from an authorized strength of 180, described finding 6 soldiers frozen to death in their foxholes on the morning of December 24th. They had burned everything combustible trying to stay warm, including their own equipment and personal effects. When the fuel ran out, they huddled together for warmth, and the cold killed them anyway. The captain had written that he no longer knew whether he was commanding soldiers or presiding over a slow-motion execution. Another letter from a battalion commander with 27 years of service requested permission to withdraw his unit to positions 2 kilometers behind the front line, where an abandoned village offered buildings that could provide shelter. The request had been denied by division headquarters, which cited Hitler's stand-fast order and threatened relief from command if the request was repeated. The battalion commander's final paragraph stated that he had followed orders and remained in position, and that as of his writing, 163 men from his battalion had died from cold-related injuries that would have been prevented by access to heated shelter. Richter read these letters late at night when the headquarters staff had retired, and he was alone with the accumulated documentation of his choice to obey rather than resist. Each letter represented officers doing their duty and watching men die as a result. Each casualty figure represented someone's son or husband or father, reduced to a number in a statistical table that measured the human cost of ideological conviction. The letter that destroyed whatever remained of Richter's peace of mind arrived on January 9th, the same day Steinberg's son was killed 200 kilometers to the north. It came from a lieutenant commanding a platoon in the sector where Lieutenant Hans Schmidt served. The letter was brief and factual, reporting that Lieutenant Schmidt had died on December 29th from complications of frostbite and exposure. Schmidt had refused evacuation while men under his command remained in position, and by the time his condition became critical, transport was no longer available. He had died in a field hospital tent with inadequate heating and no morphine for pain management. The letter included personal effects, a photograph, a watch, a final letter Schmidt had written to his family but never mailed. Richter opened the letter and read the words the boy he had raised had written in what must have been the final hours before cold and infection claimed him. "Uncle Adolf, if you receive this, it means I did not survive. I want you to know that I understood why we remained in these positions, despite conditions that made defense almost impossible. Orders are orders, and soldiers must obey. But I also want you to know that I watched good men die from cold and starvation, while we held ground that had no strategic value. I hope someday someone can explain why their deaths were necessary. I hope you can explain it to their families. I hope you can explain it to yourself. Your loving nephew, Hans." Richter sat alone in his office with the letter spread on his desk and the casualty report stacked beside it. 63,000 men lost. One of them was his sister's son, the boy he had helped raise after Verdun took his father, a 23-year-old who had believed in serving his country and who had died following orders that Richter himself could have questioned, but chose not to challenge. The pistol that sat in every German general's desk drawer seemed to grow heavier as the night progressed. Richter took it out and placed it beside the letter, considering whether some mistakes were too large to survive. But suicide required a form of courage he no longer possessed, and it would change nothing for the 62,999 other casualties whose deaths he had enabled through his obedience. He put the pistol away and picked up his pen, drafting yet another report to higher headquarters about supply shortages and casualty rates and the deteriorating condition of his army. The report would be read by staff officers in heated buildings hundreds of kilometers from the front, would be filed away in archives, and would have no effect whatsoever on the policies that continued killing men at rates that could not be sustained. While Richter wrestled with the consequences of obedience and Hoffmann adjusted to civilian life after 38 years in uniform, the systematic purge of German commanders continued across the entire Eastern Front with a thoroughness that suggested deliberate policy rather than isolated incidents of discipline enforcement. Field Marshal Friedrich Bergmann, commanding Army Group South in Ukraine, was relieved on January 12th after requesting permission to conduct a tactical withdrawal from exposed positions around Rostov-on-Don. Bergmann was 64 years old, a Prussian aristocrat whose family had produced officers for the German army across 3 centuries. His relief from command represented not just the loss of one general, but the destruction of a tradition that linked modern warfare to military customs extending back to Frederick the Great. Field Marshal Otto Lindemann, commanding Army Group North at the Siege of Leningrad, received his relief orders on January 16th after requesting authorization to shorten his lines and withdraw from salients where his forces suffered heavy casualties from Soviet counterattacks. Lindemann was 65, the oldest field commander on the Eastern Front, and his removal sent a clear message that seniority and experience provided no protection against relief for questioning Hitler's operational directives. The pattern repeated itself at corps and division level. Generals who requested tactical flexibility were replaced by officers who promised absolute obedience. Commanders who cited casualty rates or supply shortages as justification for operational adjustments found themselves reassigned to administrative positions or forced into retirement. The Wehrmacht's command structure was being systematically purged of officers who believed professional military judgment should influence tactical decisions. General Franz Waldheim, watching this purge from his office in Berlin, compiled statistics that documented the scope of the transformation. 35 senior officers relieved of command between December 1st and January 31st. 3 field marshals, 8 army commanders, 14 corps commanders, and 10 division commanders removed from their positions in a span of 60 days. The purge represented approximately one-third of all senior leadership positions on the Eastern Front. Waldheim understood what those numbers meant in operational terms. Experienced commanders who understood the capabilities and limitations of their forces were being replaced by officers selected primarily for political reliability. The institutional knowledge accumulated through years of combat experience was being discarded in favor of ideological conformity. The German army was destroying its own command effectiveness at precisely the moment when that effectiveness was most desperately needed. He drafted a memorandum analyzing the long-term consequences of the purge, projecting how the loss of experienced leadership would degrade operational performance and increase casualty rates over time. The memorandum was carefully worded to avoid direct criticism of Hitler's decisions, focusing instead on objective analysis of how command changes affected military effectiveness. Waldheim submitted the document to the Chief of the High Command, hoping that professional analysis might penetrate the ideological barriers that surrounded Hitler's headquarters. The response arrived 3 days later. Waldheim was thanked for his analysis and informed that his expertise would be better utilized in a position where he could focus on administrative matters without the distractions of operational planning. He was being reassigned to command of occupation forces in Norway, effective immediately. The reassignment was phrased as a promotion, recognizing his valuable service and trusting him with important responsibilities. Everyone who read the orders understood it was exile, removing a truth-teller from positions where his truths might interfere with policies based on fantasy rather than fact. The purge had now consumed all 5 generals who had signed the original request for authorization to withdraw. Rausch was in forced retirement in Berlin. Hoffmann had been cashiered and stripped of all military standing. Richter remained in command of Ninth Army, but as a broken man whose obedience had cost him the boy he had raised as a son. Waldheim was being shipped to Norway, where his professional expertise would be wasted managing occupation duties. And Steinberg stood alone at the center, having chosen to preserve his command by signing the charges against Hoffmann, now presiding over an army group that continued to suffer casualties at unsustainable rates while mourning a son who had died following the same orders Steinberg had chosen not to challenge. But the most significant development was not the destruction of the old guard. It was the rise of officers who understood what the purge meant and adjusted their behavior accordingly. General Klaus Werner had been a relatively junior division commander in November 1941. By February 1942, he commanded Army Group Center, promoted over dozens of more senior and experienced officers to replace Steinberg, who was quietly reassigned to administrative duties in Germany with the understanding that his field command days had ended. Werner's rise had nothing to do with military brilliance or tactical innovation. He had never written doctrine or pioneered new operational concepts. His service record showed competence but not distinction, adequate performance but not excellence. What Werner possessed was an understanding of how to survive and advance in a system where telling Hitler what he wanted to hear mattered more than telling him the truth. Werner's first briefing to Hitler as Army Group Center commander established the pattern he would follow throughout his tenure. He reported that German forces had stabilized the front, that Soviet offensive operations were weakening, and that preparations for renewed German attacks could begin by late February. Every element of this assessment was false. The front remained fluid. Soviet attacks continued with undiminished intensity, and German forces lacked the strength or supplies for offensive operations of any kind. But Werner understood that Hitler wanted to hear about stabilization and future offensives, not about continued deterioration and necessary withdrawals. So Werner provided the narrative Hitler desired, secure in the knowledge that when reality inevitably contradicted his optimistic assessments, he could blame subordinates for failures of execution rather than accept responsibility for fraudulent reporting. The other generals watched Werner's rise and learned the lesson it taught. Honesty led to relief from command. Optimistic assessments, regardless of their relationship to actual conditions, led to promotion in Hitler's favor. Officers who wanted to survive and advance learned to tell comforting lies rather than uncomfortable truths. The transformation of Wehrmacht command culture from professionalism to sycophancy happened with remarkable speed. By March 1942, barely 3 months after the purge began, the German army on the Eastern Front was being commanded by officers who had learned that career advancement required political acumen rather than military competence, that pleasing superiors mattered more than leading subordinates effectively, and that the appearance of confidence was more valuable than the reality of capability. Heinrich Rausch observed this transformation from his enforced retirement in Berlin, watching the army he had helped build being corrupted by the very system it was supposed to serve. He maintained contact with other officers who had been relieved or forced into retirement. A growing network of exiled professionals who met quietly in private homes and shared information about the deteriorating situation at the front. They called themselves the Old Guard Council, though the name was informal and carried no official standing. The membership included 3 former field marshals, a dozen former Army and Corps commanders, and several dozen division and brigade commanders who had been purged for questioning orders or requesting tactical flexibility. Together, they represented centuries of military experience and professional expertise that was now sitting idle while less competent officers led armies into disasters that professional soldiers could see coming but lacked the authority to prevent. The council began documenting the military consequences of Hitler's decision-making, compiling casualty statistics, analyzing operational failures, and recording instances where professional military advice had been overruled in favor of decisions based on ideology or personal whim. The documentation served no immediate purpose, but the members understood they were creating a historical record that might someday be valuable for understanding how a military force of such initial effectiveness had been systematically undermined by its own leadership. Rausch hosted many of these meetings in his Berlin apartment, a modest space that contrasted sharply with the headquarters he had commanded just months earlier. The discussions that took place in that apartment ranged across a tactical analysis, strategic assessment, and increasingly philosophical questions about duty and loyalty that had no clear answers. One conversation, held in late February 1942, captured the central dilemma facing officers who believed professional military judgment should guide operational decisions, but who served in a system where such judgment was actively suppressed. The participants included Rausch, Bergmann, and a dozen other senior officers representing every branch of service and every theater of operations. They had assembled to discuss whether professional officers had a duty to oppose decisions they believed would lead to military disaster, and if so, what form that opposition should take. Bergmann, the Prussian aristocrat whose family tradition emphasized absolute loyalty to constituted authority, argued that military officers had no business involving themselves in political matters, and that the proper response to orders one disagreed with was to obey and accept the consequences. We are soldiers, not politicians. Our oath is to the state, and in the German tradition, that means obedience to whoever holds legitimate authority. If Hitler makes poor military decisions, that is unfortunate, but it does not give us the right to substitute our judgment for his. We can advise, we can recommend, we can present professional analysis. But when orders are given, we must obey. Rausch responded with the perspective of someone who had been fired for offering exactly the kind of professional advice Bergmann described. Your position assumes that the person giving orders is acting in the state's interest and is merely mistaken about military details. What happens when the person giving orders is actively destroying the army through decisions that have no military rationale? At what point does obedience to a leader become betrayal of the country that leader claims to serve? I was fired for telling Hitler that his stand-fast order would result in catastrophic casualties. Those casualties have occurred exactly as predicted. My obedience to Hitler would have required me to participate in the unnecessary destruction of German forces. How is that serving Germany? A former Corps commander who had been relieved for conducting an unauthorized withdrawal interjected with the practical perspective of someone who had faced the choice between obedience and military necessity. The question is not what we should do in the abstract, but what we can do given the realities of the system we serve. We have seen what happens to officers who disobey orders or who persist in offering unwanted advice. We are all sitting in this room because we made choices that Hitler found unacceptable. We can debate the philosophy of civil-military relations, but the practical reality is that Hitler has absolute authority and will use that authority to destroy anyone who challenges him. So what exactly are we proposing? Another memorandum that will be ignored? Another request for tactical flexibility that will result in more relief orders? The discussion continued for hours, circling around questions that had no satisfactory answers. The officers in that room represented the finest military minds Germany possessed, but they were powerless to influence decisions being made by a political leader who had demonstrated he would not tolerate dissent or independent judgment. The conversation eventually turned to darker subjects, with several participants suggesting that the only way to prevent continued military disasters was to remove Hitler from power through means that went well beyond professional military channels. The suggestion was not developed into any concrete proposal, but the fact it was raised at all indicated how far some officers had moved from traditional notions of obedience and loyalty. Rausch ended the meeting with a statement that captured the tragic position of professional soldiers serving in a system that had turned professional expertise into a liability rather than an asset. We have each made choices that ended our careers. We chose to tell the truth when lies were wanted, to save lives when sacrifice was demanded, to exercise professional judgment when blind obedience was required. History will judge whether our choices were correct. But I would rather be sitting in this room as a fired general who tried to do right than commanding armies while participating in avoidable disasters. The Old Guard Council continued to meet through the spring of 1942, documenting the consequences of decisions they had warned against and watching as the disaster on the Eastern Front unfolded with the inevitability of a Greek tragedy. They could not prevent what was happening, but they could bear witness to it, preserving a record that might someday serve as a cautionary tale about what happens when political ideology replaces professional expertise in military decision-making. While the Old Guard Council met in Berlin, Ernst Hoffmann adapted to civilian life with the bitter knowledge that his court-martial had served its intended purpose. The message to other officers was clear. Disobedience would be punished regardless of military justification, and the punishment would be severe enough to deter others from making similar choices. But Hoffmann discovered that being cashiered did not mean being forgotten. Letters arrived from officers who had served under his command, many of them expressing gratitude for the decision that had saved their lives. A captain whose company had been among the forces withdrawn from the threatened encirclement wrote that every man in his unit understood they owed their survival to Hoffmann's disobedience. A major who had lost a leg during the withdrawal but survived wrote that he would rather be a crippled veteran than a dead hero, and that Hoffmann's choice had given him a future his orders would have taken away. The letters accumulated in a drawer in Hoffmann's small apartment, physical evidence that military success and professional disgrace could coexist, that saving lives and violating orders were not always contradictory objectives. Hoffmann read these letters when the weight of his cashiering felt too heavy to bear, finding in them a form of validation that no military tribunal could provide or revoke. He also received visitors, officers on leave from the front who sought him out to thank him personally or to seek advice on the impossible choices they now faced themselves. These conversations revealed that the dilemma Hoffmann had confronted was not unique to his situation, but had become endemic throughout the Wehrmacht's command structure. Officers at every level faced decisions where following orders meant accepting unnecessary casualties and where exercising professional judgment meant risking their careers. One visitor, a colonel commanding a regiment in Army Group South, described a situation almost identical to Hoffmann's encirclement scenario. Soviet forces had achieved a breakthrough that threatened to cut off his regiment. He had requested permission to withdraw, been denied, and now faced the choice between obeying orders that would likely result in his regiment's destruction or withdrawing without authorization and facing court-martial. The colonel asked Hoffmann what he should do, seeking advice from someone who had faced the same choice and accepted the consequences. Hoffmann's response was careful, acknowledging that he could not make the decision for another officer, but could only share his own reasoning and experience. I chose to save my men because I believed that was my primary duty as their commander. The court-martial, the cashiering, the loss of my pension and honors, these were prices I was willing to pay for that choice. But you must understand that those prices are real and permanent. If you disobey orders, you will be destroyed professionally. Your family will suffer. Your reputation will be damaged. You must decide whether saving your men is worth paying that price. I made my choice. You must make yours. The colonel left without indicating what decision he would make. 2 weeks later, Hoffmann learned through informal channels that the colonel had obeyed orders, his regiment had been encircled, and 60% of his men had been killed or captured before the survivors managed to break out. The colonel himself had been relieved from command for losing his regiment, proving that obedience offered no protection against professional destruction when obedience led to disaster. The contradictions inherent in the Wehrmacht's command culture had become impossible to ignore. Officers who disobeyed orders faced court-martial. Officers who obeyed orders that led to military failures faced relief from command. The only path to survival was to obey orders that succeeded, but success often required the kind of tactical flexibility that orders explicitly forbade. The system had become a trap that destroyed careers regardless of the choices officers made. By late March 1942, the casualties from the winter campaign had exceeded 1 million German soldiers killed, wounded, or missing on the Eastern Front. The purge of commanders had removed 35 senior officers and dozens more at junior levels. The command culture that had made the Wehrmacht the most effective fighting force in the world had been replaced by a culture of sycophancy and deception, where survival required telling superiors what they wanted to hear, rather than what they needed to know. The brotherhood of 5 generals who had attempted to save an army had been completely destroyed. Rausch sat in exile documenting disaster. Hoffmann lived in disgrace, his career erased. Richter commanded what remained of Ninth Army while consuming himself with guilt over choices that had cost the life of the boy he had raised. Waldheim managed occupation forces in Norway, his expertise wasted on administrative trivia. Steinberg had been quietly reassigned to training duties in Germany. His field command career ended by the choice to preserve his position through signing the charges that destroyed Hoffmann, mourning a son whose death proved that preservation had saved nothing that mattered. The question of whether their sacrifice had served any purpose remained unanswered. The casualties they had predicted had materialized exactly as forecast. The army they had tried to save through tactical withdrawal had suffered catastrophic losses by standing fast. The professional military judgment they had offered had been proven correct by events. But none of that vindication could restore their careers or undo the transformation of the Wehrmacht's command culture from professionalism to political reliability. And in the distance, like thunder before a storm, the consequences of the winter purge began to echo forward into future disasters that would make the casualties of 1941 seem modest by comparison. The pattern had been established. The lesson had been learned. Obedience mattered more than competence. Ideology trumped expertise. And the price for that transformation would be measured in the deaths of millions and the ultimate destruction of everything the German army had once represented. The pocket formed around Stalingrad with the geometric precision of a military textbook diagram, 2 Soviet armored pincers meeting west of the city on November 23, 1942, cutting off the German Sixth Army and transforming 100,000 square kilometers of Russian steppe into the largest prison camp in history. General Friedrich von Paulus stood in his headquarters at Gumrach Airfield, studying the same maps that had documented the encirclement, and understood with absolute clarity that he was facing the identical choice that had destroyed Wilhelm Steinberg's career and shattered the brotherhood of generals exactly 1 year earlier. The numbers told the story with brutal simplicity. 250,000 German and Romanian troops surrounded, supplies sufficient for perhaps 10 days at reduced ration levels. Soviet forces tightening the encirclement hourly. Winter approaching with temperatures already falling toward the -40 degrees that had killed so many men during the previous year's campaign. And from Hitler's headquarters, the same order that had been issued 12 months ago. Stand fast, no withdrawal. Hold every position to the last man. Paulus was 52 years old, a career staff officer who had spent most of his professional life in planning positions rather than field commands. He had studied the winter crisis of 1941 at the War College, had analyzed the decisions made by Steinberg and Rausch and Hoffmann, had written professional assessments of what went wrong and how it might have been prevented. He knew the history. He understood the consequences. And now he stood in the same position those men had occupied, facing a choice that would define not just his career, but his character. The staff officers assembled in the headquarters represented the finest military minds Sixth Army possessed. They had calculated breakout routes, assessed German combat power, estimated Soviet defensive strength, and concluded unanimously that immediate withdrawal was the only option that offered any chance of saving the army. The window for successful breakout was perhaps 72 hours. After that, Soviet reinforcements would seal the pocket so thoroughly that escape would become impossible. Paulus drafted the breakout request on November 24th, writing and rewriting the document through the night, trying to find language that would convince Hitler to authorize an action that violated every principle the Führer had established during the previous winter's crisis. The final version was 12 pages long, filled with tactical details and casualty projections, explaining with methodical precision why remaining in the pocket meant certain destruction, while immediate breakout offered reasonable chances of success. He read the document one final time before transmission, seeing in its careful arguments the same logic that Steinberg had employed, the same professional military judgment that had been rejected 12 months earlier. The faces of Rausch and Hoffmann and the other purge generals seemed to hover over the pages, warning him about what happened to officers who told Hitler uncomfortable truths. Paulus picked up his pen and added a final paragraph, words that transformed a professional military recommendation into something closer to a plea for permission to survive. This request is submitted with full understanding of the Führer's position on withdrawal operations. It represents purely tactical analysis of the military situation facing Sixth Army. Authorization is requested only if the Führer judges such action consistent with larger strategic objectives. Final decision rests entirely with the Führer's wisdom and judgment. The addition was cowardice disguised as deference, an attempt to request permission while simultaneously indicating that Paulus would not press the issue if permission was denied. He was asking for authorization to save his army while making clear he lacked the courage to fight for that authorization if it was refused. The response from Hitler's headquarters arrived within 18 hours. Stand fast. Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad. Supply would be maintained by airlift. No breakout would be permitted. The Führer had spoken, and his word was final. Paulus read the response and felt the weight of history repeating itself with the precision of a curse. He was Steinberg. His army was Army Group Center. The date was different, but the situation was identical. And unlike Hoffmann, who had possessed the courage to disobey and save his men, Paulus found himself paralyzed by the knowledge of what happened to generals who chose conscience over obedience. He drafted a second request on November 26, this version even more carefully worded, even more deferential, making the case for breakout while repeatedly emphasizing his willingness to follow whatever orders were given. The response was identical to the first. Stand fast. No withdrawal. The pattern from winter 1941 was being repeated with such exactness that it seemed less like coincidence than destiny. The Chief of Staff of Sixth Army, a colonel who had served under Paulus for 3 years, found his commander sitting alone in the headquarters bunker on the evening of November 27, the breakout window closing with each passing hour. The colonel spoke with the bluntness of a man who understood that professional courtesy meant nothing when an entire army faced annihilation. General, we have perhaps 48 hours before breakout becomes impossible. The men are ready. We have sufficient fuel and ammunition for the operation. Every senior commander supports immediate action. If we move now, we can save this army. If we wait for permission that will never come, we condemn 250,000 men to death or captivity. Paulus looked at his chief of staff and saw the same determination that must have driven Hoffmann to make his unauthorized withdrawal. But Paulus had studied what happened to Hoffmann. The court-martial, the cashiering, the destruction of a career, the public humiliation, and behind those professional consequences lurked darker implications. The Gestapo had begun investigating officers suspected of defeatism. Families of disgraced officers faced social ostracism and worse. The price of disobedience had increased since winter 1941. The silence stretched between the two men until the colonel understood that no order for breakout would be given. He saluted and left the bunker without another word. Paulus sat alone, understanding that his paralysis had just sealed the fate of Sixth Army. The window would close, the pocket would become a death trap, and history would record that Friedrich von Paulus had learned exactly the wrong lesson from the purge of winter 1941. The lessons Paulus learned were simple and fatal. Heinrich Rausch had been fired for telling Hitler the truth. Ernst Hoffmann had been court-martialed for saving his men through disobedience. Wilhelm Steinberg had destroyed his career by choosing between his friends and his duty. The price of independent judgment was professional destruction. Therefore, the path to survival lay in absolute obedience, regardless of consequences. The logic was impeccable and catastrophic. By January 1943, 91,000 survivors of Sixth Army marched into Soviet captivity. The rest, over 150,000 men, lay dead in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad or in the steppes surrounding the city. Only 5,000 of those 91,000 prisoners would ever see Germany again. Paulus himself survived to become the highest-ranking German officer captured during the war, living evidence that obedience to Hitler offered no protection against disaster. Franz Waldheim learned of Stalingrad's fall while stationed in Norway, reading the casualty reports with the numb recognition that everything the Old Guard Council had predicted and documented was coming true with mathematical precision. He sat in his Oslo office, surrounded by the comfortable banality of occupation duty, and calculated that if Paulus had ordered an immediate breakout on November 24th, approximately 150,000 German soldiers would have escaped the pocket. The cost of Paulus's fear could be measured in the lives of those who died because their commander lacked the courage to disobey. Waldheim added Stalingrad to the documentation the Old Guard Council had been compiling, creating a comprehensive record of how the purge of winter 1941 had established patterns of cowardice and sycophancy that led directly to subsequent disasters. The document was hidden in multiple locations, insurance against the day when truth might again have value in a country currently devoted to official lies. But documentation of disaster was not the same as prevention, and the Old Guard Council had no power to influence decisions being made by officers who had learned that survival required submission to Hitler's will, regardless of military consequences. The tragedy unfolding on the Eastern Front was visible to anyone willing to see, but seeing disaster and preventing it were different capabilities. And the Wehrmacht's command structure had been purged of officers who possessed the courage to act on what they saw. Yet not all the lessons from winter 1941 led inexorably to catastrophe. In France and Italy, some German commanders who remembered what had happened to those who could not adapt developed the tactical flexibility that Hitler's system tried to suppress. They conducted fighting withdrawals when positions became untenable, preserved their forces for future battles, and when they reported these actions to higher headquarters, they framed them as tactical repositioning rather than retreat. These officers understood that survival required not just obedience, but creative interpretation of orders, finding space between Hitler's ideological demands and operational reality where professional judgment could still function. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in North Africa, though ultimately defeated by overwhelming Allied material superiority, demonstrated how commanders could maintain tactical flexibility even within Hitler's constraining system. When encirclement threatened, Rommel withdrew. When positions became untenable, he repositioned. When Hitler ordered attacks that made no military sense, Rommel delayed implementation while reporting preparation difficulties. His forces suffered defeats, but they were military defeats caused by enemy action rather than self-inflicted disasters caused by ideological rigidity. Rommel's eventual forced suicide in October 1944 proved that even creative compliance offered only temporary protection. But in the years before his death, he demonstrated that some space for professional military judgment still existed for commanders skilled enough and politically astute enough to exploit it. In Italy, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring conducted a masterful fighting withdrawal up the Italian peninsula, preserving his forces through tactical flexibility while avoiding the kind of catastrophic encirclements that consumed armies on the Eastern Front. Kesselring understood the lessons of winter 1941 and applied them in reverse. Where the purged generals had requested permission and been destroyed, Kesselring acted first and reported later, framing tactical withdrawals as preparations for counterattacks and defensive repositioning as economy of force measures. He gave Hitler the illusion of resistance to retreat while practicing the reality of tactical flexibility, saving German forces that would have been annihilated by more rigid adherence to standfast orders. These examples of successful adaptation did not redeem the system that made such adaptation necessary, but they demonstrated that the Winter Purge had not completely destroyed all capacity for independent military judgment. Some officers learned to navigate between Hitler's ideological demands and operational necessity, preserving their forces and their commands through combinations of tactical skill and political acumen that the purge generals of winter 1941 had either lacked or refused to employ. But these successes were exceptions that proved the rule. For every Rommel or Kesselring who found ways to maintain professional effectiveness within Hitler's constraining system, a dozen generals followed Werner's path of sycophantic compliance or Paulus's paralysis of fear-induced obedience. The overall trajectory established by the Winter Purge pointed toward institutional degradation and ultimate collapse. The seeds planted during the winter crisis of 1941 bore their darkest fruit on July 20th, 1944, when a bomb exploded in Hitler's conference room at the Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. The assassination attempt failed, Hitler surviving with minor injuries, but the failed plot unleashed a wave of arrests and executions that consumed hundreds of officers suspected of involvement or sympathy with the conspirators. Ernst Hoffmann had been living quietly in Berlin since his court-martial, avoiding political activity, maintaining minimal contact with other cashiered officers, trying to survive in a city increasingly dominated by Gestapo surveillance and arbitrary arrest. He had not been directly involved in the July 20th plot, had known nothing of the specific plans, had met Klaus von Stauffenberg only once at a social gathering where they discussed military history rather than assassination conspiracies. But Hoffmann's name appeared on a list the Gestapo had been compiling for months, a roster of officers who had been relieved or cashiered for questioning Hitler's orders or requesting tactical flexibility. The list represented potential enemies of the state, men whose professional disgrace marked them as candidates for more serious forms of disloyalty. When the July 20th plot failed and Hitler demanded blood vengeance against everyone who might have supported such treason, Hoffmann's name moved from surveillance list to arrest warrant. The Gestapo came for him on the morning of July 23rd, 3 days after the bomb exploded. They arrived at his apartment at 5 in the morning, pounding on the door with the aggressive authority of men who enjoyed their power and the fear it produced. Hoffmann dressed quickly and went with them without protest, understanding that resistance would change nothing and might endanger his wife. The interrogation lasted 6 days, conducted in the basement of Gestapo headquarters on Prince Albrechtstrasse, where questions were asked and answered in rooms designed to break human will through systematic application of pain and terror. Hoffmann maintained that he knew nothing of any plot, had participated in no conspiracy, had committed no crime beyond the disobedience for which he had already been court-martialed and cashiered 3 years earlier. The interrogators were not interested in truth or evidence. They were interested in confessions that would justify predetermined verdicts. The fact that Hoffmann had disobeyed orders in winter 1941 was presented as proof of lifelong disloyalty. The fact that he had been cashiered demonstrated he harbored grudges against the regime. The fact that he knew other officers who had been purged suggested conspiracy. The circular logic admitted no defense because defense itself was considered additional evidence of guilt. The trial before the People's Court took place on August 7th in a proceeding that resembled theater more than jurisprudence. Judge Roland Freisler presided, screaming accusations and cutting off attempts at defense, performing for an audience rather than seeking truth. Hoffmann stood in the dock wearing civilian clothes, denied even the dignity of the uniform he had worn for 38 years, and listened to himself being described as a traitor who had spent his entire career undermining the state he claimed to serve. The verdict was announced before the trial began: guilty of treason, conspiracy to assassinate the Führer, and participation in plots to overthrow the government. Sentence of death by hanging to be carried out within 24 hours. Hoffmann heard the verdict without visible reaction, his face maintaining the composure of a professional soldier who had long ago accepted that some prices must be paid regardless of their justice. They hanged him on August 8th at Plötzensee prison, one of nearly 5,000 Germans executed in the aftermath of the July 20th plot. The method was designed to maximize suffering, slow strangulation, rather than the quick death a firing squad would have provided. Hoffmann's last words, recorded by a guard who would later testify at post-war trials, were spoken calmly despite the circumstances. "I served Germany, not one man. The 40,000 I saved in December 1941 know the truth. History will judge whether I was a traitor or whether treason lay elsewhere." The rope cut off further speech. Ernst Hoffmann died at age 59, executed for the crime of saving his soldiers' lives through tactical judgment that contradicted political orthodoxy. His body was cremated and his ashes scattered, erasing even the grave that might have marked his service and sacrifice. Heinrich Rausch learned of Hoffmann's execution while imprisoned in a Gestapo facility, arrested on suspicion of sympathizing with the plotters, though no evidence connected him to the actual conspiracy. He spent 3 months in custody, subjected to interrogations that stopped just short of the full torture treatment reserved for confirmed conspirators. Released finally because even the Gestapo could not manufacture evidence against a man who had spent the past 3 years in forced retirement with minimal contact with active duty officers. Rausch emerged from imprisonment in November 1944 to find Berlin being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing, the war clearly lost, and the officer corps he had helped build consumed by the paranoia and purges that had started with the winter crisis of 1941 and now reached their logical conclusion in mass executions and institutional collapse. He resumed his quiet documentation of disaster, adding Hoffmann's execution to the growing archive that recorded how professional military judgment had been replaced by ideological fanaticism, and how that replacement had produced catastrophe after catastrophe. The documentation served no immediate purpose, but Rausch understood that someday, when the madness ended, people would want to know how a nation had destroyed itself through systematic rejection of competence in favor of loyalty. Friedrich Bergmann did not survive the post-July 20th purge, dying under interrogation in Gestapo custody, his heart failing during questioning that combined psychological pressure with physical abuse calibrated to break elderly aristocrats who had spent their lives in positions of privilege. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, though everyone understood that nothing about Gestapo custody was natural. Otto Lindemann survived the war but died in Soviet captivity in 1946, one of thousands of German officers who surrendered to Red Army forces and disappeared into prisoner of war camps from which many never returned. His death, like so many others, was documented only in Soviet archives that would not be opened for decades. Adolf Richter did not wait for arrest or execution or Soviet captivity. He shot himself in his Berlin apartment in March 1945 as Soviet forces closed on the city, leaving a note that explained nothing and apologized to no one. His sister, the mother of Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, who had died in the frozen positions Richter had refused to evacuate, received the news of her brother's suicide with the bitter observation that he had finally found the courage that eluded him in December 1941. Wilhelm Steinberg survived the war physically intact but spiritually destroyed, living in quiet retirement in Bavaria, refusing all interviews and declining all requests to write memoirs or provide historical commentary. The loss of his son had broken something fundamental inside him, transforming the choice to preserve his career into a weight that grew heavier with each passing year. He died in 1957, taking to his grave whatever justifications he had constructed for the choices that saved his position at the cost of his friendships, his conscience, and the son whose death had proven that preservation purchased through betrayal preserved nothing that mattered. Franz Waldheim returned from Norway after the war, testified at several war crimes trials, provided documentation to historians researching the Wehrmacht's Eastern Front campaigns, and lived until 1968, long enough to see the publication of the first comprehensive histories that confirmed everything the Old Guard Council had documented about the systematic destruction of professional military judgment. Klaus Werner, the yes man who had replaced Steinberg as Army Group Center commander, and risen through obedience and optimistic lies, found himself commanding the defense of Berlin in April 1945. In the final weeks of the war, with Soviet forces closing on the city and defeat inevitable, Werner finally told Hitler the truth, reporting that Berlin could not be held and that continued resistance served no military purpose. Hitler's response was to relieve Werner of command, firing him with the same casual brutality he had employed against truth-tellers throughout the war. Werner survived to face war crimes charges, was convicted of following illegal orders, and spent 12 years in prison, living proof that even liars eventually run out of useful lies. The final scene of the drama that began with 5 generals requesting permission to save their army played out in Hitler's bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin during the last days of April 1945. Soviet artillery pounded the city above, reducing the capital of the Third Reich to rubble, while in the bunker complex below, Hitler continued to move phantom divisions around maps and issue orders to armies that no longer existed. He was still firing generals for lacking sufficient determination, still accusing officers of defeatism and cowardice, still insisting that willpower and determination could overcome material disadvantages. The pattern established in winter 1941 continued until the very end. Hitler's fundamental conviction that obedience mattered more than competence never wavering, even as the regime he led collapsed into fire and rubble. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler shot himself, escaping the consequences of decisions that had killed millions and destroyed the country he claimed to love. The war in Europe ended 8 days later with German forces surrendering unconditionally to Allied commanders who accepted the capitulation of a military force that had begun the conflict as perhaps the most effective fighting machine in history and ended it as a broken remnant commanded by officers selected for loyalty rather than ability. The costs could be calculated in multiple currencies. 4 million German military casualties on the Eastern Front alone, millions more civilian dead, cities destroyed, a nation divided, an army's reputation permanently stained by crimes committed in the name of ideology. And at the center of it all, the pattern established during the winter crisis of 1941, when professional military judgment was rejected in favor of political orthodoxy, and when officers who told truth were destroyed to encourage others to embrace useful lies. The question of whether the Brotherhood of 5 generals could have prevented any of this remained unanswerable. Their attempt to save Army Group Center through tactical withdrawal had been rejected. Their professional expertise had been discarded. Their careers had been destroyed or compromised. And the army they tried to preserve had suffered casualties that might have been prevented by listening to men who understood warfare as both science and art. But their failure to prevent disaster did not make their attempt meaningless. In a system designed to reward sycophancy and punish honesty, they had chosen truth over advancement, conscience over career, duty to their men over obedience to orders they knew would result in unnecessary deaths. The prices they paid varied. Rausch lost his command, but survived to document the disaster. Hoffmann saved 40,000 lives and was hanged for treason. Richter obeyed and consumed himself with guilt until suicide seemed preferable to continued existence. Steinberg chose preservation over principle and lived with that choice until the death of his son proved that some prices are paid regardless of the bargains we make. Waldheim watched it all from exile and recorded what he saw. Their story became a case study taught at military academies in the decades following the war, an examination of civil-military relations and the relationship between obedience and professional judgment that had no simple answers but raised essential questions. At the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, a course on leadership ethics included a week-long examination of the winter 1941 crisis and the choices facing German generals who saw disaster approaching but lacked the authority or courage to prevent it. The instructor was a colonel who had served in Vietnam, a combat veteran in his early 60s, whose gray hair and steady gaze suggested someone who had faced his own impossible choices and lived with their consequences. He stood before a classroom of mid-career officers, most of them lieutenant colonels and colonels themselves, men at the age and rank where they would soon face decisions that would define not just their careers but their character. Gentlemen, you are looking at photographs of men who faced a fundamental question that every military officer must answer at some point in their career. What defines a good soldier? Is it obedience to orders, regardless of their moral or tactical soundness? Is it duty to the men you command, even when that duty conflicts with directions from higher authority? Is it loyalty to your country, even when serving your country seems to require disobeying the leaders who claim to represent it? These 5 German generals answered that question in different ways. Rausch spoke truth and was destroyed for his honesty. Hoffmann saved lives and was executed for his disobedience. Richter chose obedience and died consumed by guilt. Steinberg tried to preserve his position and watched his son die following the same orders he had chosen not to challenge. Waldheim documented disaster but could not prevent it. None of them found a perfect answer because no perfect answer existed. A major in the back row raised his hand. "Sir, what should they have done? What was the right answer?" The colonel's response came without hesitation, but with the weight of someone who understood the impossibility of the question. "There was no right answer, Major. That is the point. Sometimes the right thing to do is to disobey orders and accept the consequences. Sometimes the right thing to do is to obey and live with the burden of that obedience. Sometimes there is no right thing, only terrible choices and worse alternatives. But I will tell you this. Ernst Hoffmann saved 40,000 lives and was hanged as a traitor. The men he saved knew he was no traitor. Their children knew it. Their grandchildren know it. When you face your impossible choice, ask yourself what you want people to remember about the decision you made and choose accordingly." The lesson continued with analysis of the tactical situation, examination of the casualty figures, discussion of the long-term consequences of the winter purge. But the essential truth was already delivered. Military officers serve multiple masters, orders and conscience, duty to subordinates and loyalty to superiors, professional judgment and political realities. When those loyalties conflict, the choice reveals character and shapes institutions in ways that echo far beyond any individual career. The winter of 1941 ended. Spring came. The war continued. Men died in numbers that made individual sacrifice meaningless, except to those who loved the dead and those who ordered them to die. And the pattern established when 5 generals tried to save an army and were destroyed for trying echoed through every subsequent disaster until the final catastrophe consumed everything and everyone in flames that purified nothing and taught lessons that few were willing to learn. History records their names and documents their choices, preserving for future generations the eternal questions about duty and obedience that admit no final answers but demand that every officer in every generation confront them honestly and choose wisely, understanding that wisdom itself may not be enough when systems turn virtue into liability and punish competence to reward compliance. The 5 generals of winter 1941 made their choices and paid their prices, and in their example remains the only guidance available for those who will face similar choices in circumstances we cannot predict but must prepare ourselves to navigate with honor intact and conscience clear, whatever the cost.